Welcome back to the Sharing English podcast, where we explore stories from the English-speaking world, spoken slowly and clearly for curious English learners like you. Let's get started. Hey everyone, it's your host, Freya. If you've ever learned English, or you've ever been on my social media with an episode that spoke about American football, there's a good chance you've asked this question or seen somebody else ask me this question. Why do Americans call their sport football if football is played with your feet? It's a fair question. But once you start looking around the English-speaking world, things become even more confusing. There's association football, what many people simply call football, and what Americans usually call soccer. There's American football, Canadian football, rugby football, Australian rules football, Gaelic football. How did all of these completely different sports end up sharing the same name? Today, we're going back hundreds of years to discover that these sports are much more closely related than they first appear. The first surprise is this. The word football did not originally mean a game where you kick the ball. Instead, it referred to a game played on foot, rather than on horseback. Centuries ago in Britain, horseback games were generally associated with wealthy nobles, while ordinary people played games on foot. Over time, many different games played on foot became known as football. No one imagined that hundreds of years later there would be debates about which football was the real football. The earliest forms of football, going way back to medieval Britain, look nothing like today's sports. Imagine two neighboring villages. Hundreds of people gather in the streets and fields. There are very few rules, and the field might actually stretch across an entire village. The goal could be simply to move a ball to a particular church, bridge, or landmark. Matches could last for hours. Sometimes they became so rough that kings tried to ban them because people were getting injured, or because they thought people should be practicing archery instead. These games were exciting, chaotic, and often impossible to organize. Eventually, people wanted something a little more structured. By the early 19th century, football had become especially popular in Britain's famous public schools. Despite the name, British public schools are actually private schools with long histories. Schools such as Eton, Harrow, Winchester, and Rugby all loved playing football, but there was one big problem. Each school played by its own rules. Some schools preferred kicking the ball. Others allowed players to carry it. Some encouraged dribbling. Others allowed much more physical tackling. That wasn't a problem as long as students only played against classmates from their own school. But as travel became easier and clubs began organizing matches against one another, confusion quickly followed. Imagine one team arriving expecting a game where carrying the ball was perfectly legal, while the other believed only kicking was allowed, and then suddenly somebody came and tackled you to the ground. Which rules are supposed to be used? To solve this problem, clubs and schools began meeting to agree on a common set of rules. In 1863, a group of clubs in England formed the Football Association with the goal of creating one official rule book for what became known as association football. Not everyone agreed with those rules. Some clubs wanted to keep running with the ball and playing a more physical style of football. Rather than forcing everyone to play the same game, the different versions gradually separated. One branch became association football, another became rugby football. Later, as these games spread around the world, countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and Ireland adapted them even further, creating the different footballs we know today. It's a little like watching a family tree grow. The roots are the old village games of medieval Britain, but over time the branches spread in different directions, each developing its own identity while still sharing a common ancestor. Now we come to one of my favorite facts. Many people think Americans invented the word soccer. They didn't. The British did. In the 19th century, one version of the game became officially organized under the name association football. Students at Oxford University had a habit of shortening words and adding "er" to the end. Association became a sock, then a sock-er. Eventually, that became soccer. For many years, people in Britain happily used both football and soccer. It wasn't until much later that football became the overwhelmingly preferred term in Britain, while Americans continued using soccer to distinguish it from their own version of football. So the next time someone says Americans invented the word soccer, or more likely the next time someone criticizes Americans for using the word soccer, you'll know the real story. It's a British word. One school has become especially important in the development of rugby. Rugby school allowed players to pick up the ball and run with it. According to tradition, a student named William Webb Ellis ignored the existing rules during a football match and ran with the ball in his hands. Whether the story is completely true or partly a legend, rugby school became closely associated with this new style of play. Over time, rugby football developed into its own sport. Today, it has two major forms, rugby union and rugby league. Both remain hugely popular in countries such as England, Wales, New Zealand, South Africa, Australia, and many Pacific nations. So, where does American football fit into this family tree? In the late 19th century, universities in the United States began playing games that closely resembled rugby football. But American colleges gradually changed the rules. A coach named Walter Camp introduced ideas such as the line of scrimmage, the system of downs, and eventually the forward pass became an important part of the game. These changes transformed rugby football into a completely different sport. But because it had evolved from football, not appeared out of nowhere, the name remained. That's why Americans still call it football today. And even though we only kick the ball sometimes, remember that's not what football means. It simply means you play on your feet. Canada's version developed in a similar way. It shares many features with American football, but also has important differences. Canadian football is played on a larger field. Teams have 12 players instead of 11, and instead of 4 downs to gain 10 yards, Canadian teams have only 3. These differences make the game a little faster and encourage more passing and kicking. The championship game is called the Grey Cup, one of Canada's oldest sporting traditions. Australia took football in yet another direction. Australian rules football was developed during the 19th century, partly to help cricketers stay fit during the winter. It is played on a large oval field, often a cricket ground. Players can kick, hand pass, run with the ball, and take spectacular jumping catches known as marks. If you've never watched Australian football before, it's one of the most unique and fastest moving sports in the world. In Ireland, another branch of the football family developed. Gaelic football combines elements that may remind you of soccer, rugby, basketball, and even volleyball. Players can kick the ball, carry it, bounce it, and hand pass it. Like many Irish traditions, Gaelic football is closely connected to Irish culture and identity. Today, it's organized by the Gaelic Athletic Association, often called the GAA, and remains one of Ireland's most beloved sports. So, what does football mean today? Well, here's where things get interesting. If you walk into a pub in England and ask about football, people will most certainly assume you mean association football and turn on the Premier League. In the United States, they'll think you mean American football. In Canada, the answer depends on the conversation, but Canadian football and American football are both common meanings. In Australia, football might refer to Australian rules football, rugby, rugby league, or soccer, depending on the region. And in Ireland, football could mean Gaelic football or association football. The word itself hasn't changed. The culture around it has. That's why context matters so much when you're speaking English. So, which one came first? Not American football, not soccer, not rugby, not Australian football, and not Gaelic football. Instead, they all descended from much older forms of football played in Britain centuries ago. Remember to think of it as a family tree. The trunk, the largest part of the tree, represents the old village games of medieval Britain. Over time, new branches grew in different directions. Some emphasized kicking, others emphasized carrying. Some spread around the world with the British Empire and continued evolving after they arrived. The result is this wonderfully confusing collection of footballs we know today. So, why are there so many different types of football? Because the word football is much older than any of the modern sports that use it. Long before there were professional leagues, television broadcasts, or international tournaments, there were simply people playing games on foot. Over hundreds of years, those games developed different rules, different traditions, and different identities. Today, they may look completely different from one another, but they all share the same historical roots. And perhaps that's the most interesting part of the story. So, the next time someone asks why Americans call their sport football, or why the British sometimes used the word soccer, you'll know the answer isn't about one country being right or wrong, or one sport being right or wrong. It's about history and language, and the fascinating way cultures grow and change over time. Now I'm curious. When someone says football where you live, which sport do you think of first? And after hearing today's episode, do you think the name makes a little more sense? Let me know. Thanks for listening to the Sharing English podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, leave a rating or review, and share the podcast with a friend who's also learning English. You can find out more about me and the podcast at our website, www.sharing-english.com. New episodes of the Sharing English podcast are available weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. As always, let me know, what topics are you interested in hearing more about? Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep sharing English.